Have you ever wondered what it takes to survive in the world of royal communications? The glitz, the cameras, the red carpets, the smiling waves to adoring crowds. On the surface, it looks like a dream job. But what if I told you that behind the perfectly curated images, the golden palaces, and the polished headlines, there exists a ruthless, high-pressure environment where even the most seasoned professionals can feel trapped, intimidated, and powerless? Where one wrong move, one missed email, one moment of hesitation can set off a chain reaction that threatens your career, your reputation, and even your sanity. That's exactly the world that Meghan Markle and Prince Harry's director of communications, Emily Robinson, stepped into, and why. After just 5 short months, she made the decision that shocked the palace, the media, and the public alike. She resigned. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The story begins in May 2025, when Emily, a respected communications professional with years of experience in high-stakes media operations, accepted a role that, to the outside world, seemed prestigious beyond measure. Working for the Duke and Duchess of Sussex, the couple who have dominated headlines, commanded attention, and stirred controversy for over a decade, was, on paper, the opportunity of a lifetime. But the reality? It was something entirely different. Something darker. Something that, according to Emily, no one outside the inner circle could have anticipated. From the very first day, Emily noticed subtle but unmistakable signs. Meetings that were supposed to be collaborative felt more like interrogations. Requests that seemed straightforward were laced with hidden traps. And the energy in the room, the tension that underpinned every conversation, was palpable, almost suffocating. For someone who had spent her career managing complex media narratives and navigating the delicate egos of high-profile figures, this was unlike anything she had ever encountered. It wasn't the public scrutiny that intimidated her. She had handled hostile media inquiries, damaging leaks, and global scandals before. What shook her was the behavior behind closed doors, the moments that no one saw, the quiet manipulations, the subtle undermining, the microaggressions that accumulated like tiny poison darts aimed at her confidence and credibility. There were whispers, sidelong glances, urgent late-night messages, and meetings that seemed to stretch on endlessly without purpose, each leaving Emily more exhausted, more anxious, and more aware of the invisible but potent power dynamics at play. You might be asking yourself, how bad could it really be? After all, Meghan Markle and Prince Harry are public figures who often present themselves as empathetic, compassionate, and socially conscious. And in public appearances, charitable initiatives, and media statements, they have cultivated a persona of thoughtful, conscientious leaders in a world that is relentlessly judgmental. But here's the shocking truth. According to Emily, the public persona was just a mask. Behind the curated images and carefully worded press releases was a culture that, at times, she described as bullying, where staff were pressured beyond reasonable limits, criticized publicly, and manipulated into doing the impossible to protect a carefully constructed image. Emily's resignation didn't happen overnight. It was the result of months of mounting pressure, escalating conflicts, and a gradual realization that her principles, her mental health, and her professional integrity were at risk. Each day brought new challenges, new emotional spikes, and new contradictions between what she saw publicly and what was happening privately. She was torn between loyalty to her job and her commitment to the truth, between ambition and survival, between protecting herself and upholding the public image of the couple she was now representing. One of the most startling elements of Emily's experience was how quickly she realized that traditional strategies and boundaries didn't apply. The media narratives were relentless, but so were the internal pressures. Requests for approvals, revisions, and spin were not just urgent, they were impossible. Critiques were personal rather than professional. Feedback wasn't constructive, it was weaponized. And the moments that should have been routine, the planning of public appearances, press briefings, and social media campaigns, became high-stakes minefields where any misstep could be leveraged as evidence of incompetence or disloyalty. Perhaps most chilling was Emily's recounting of the psychological toll. Late nights, constant email chains, and unexpected confrontations created a state of near-constant anxiety. She described feeling watched, monitored, and judged not only by the public and the press, but by the very people she was hired to support. Every decision carried weight. Every action had potential consequences far beyond what any normal job could produce. And through it all, the expectations were unrelenting. Always perfect, always responsive, always ready to defend and defend again the public image of the Duke and Duchess. And yet, despite the challenges, Emily entered the role with optimism, professionalism, and a genuine desire to make a positive impact. She had a vision for transparent, ethical, and effective communications, one that balanced the needs of her employers with the realities of media scrutiny. She wanted to tell the story of Meghan and Harry in a way that was honest, strategic, and fair. But soon, it became apparent that this vision was incompatible with the reality she was facing. Her insights were ignored. Her suggestions were overridden. Her concerns were dismissed. And gradually, the role she had once viewed as a pinnacle of her career became a crucible of stress, doubt, and fear. The breaking point, according to Emily, came not from any single incident, but from a pattern of behavior that she could no longer tolerate. She began documenting interactions, messages, and meetings, realizing that the stress she was experiencing was not situational. It was systemic. The constant barrage of unrealistic demands, public-facing criticisms, and private undermining left her feeling trapped in a position where her professional competence was under siege. And as her resignation day approached, she was faced with a choice: endure the toxicity and compromise her values, or walk away, potentially risking public scrutiny and professional backlash, but preserving her integrity and sanity. You might be wondering, why has this story captured public attention so fiercely? Part of it is the rarity of insight into the inner workings of one of the world's most scrutinized couples. Another part is the dramatic nature of the resignation itself. A top communications professional, walking away from a role that many would consider the pinnacle of a career, citing bullying from public figures whose image is meticulously curated. And the stakes are high. This revelation doesn't just reflect on Emily. It reflects on the Duke and Duchess of Sussex, their management style, and the culture they cultivate around themselves. Even more intriguing is the timing. Emily Robinson's resignation came at a moment when Meghan and Harry were navigating both personal and professional challenges in the public eye. New projects, philanthropic endeavors, and media ventures were underway, and the sudden departure of a key communications strategist sent shockwaves through the team and the press. The ripple effect was immediate. Speculation, rumors, and internal inquiries followed, raising questions about what had occurred behind closed doors. Was it a clash of personalities? A difference in professional philosophy? Or something far more troubling, as Emily hinted in private conversations, about the treatment of staff and the pressure cooker environment she had endured? Throughout this story, one thing becomes painfully clear. Working for Meghan Markle and Prince Harry is not simply a job. It is an immersion into a complex web of expectations, emotions, and public scrutiny that few can navigate without significant personal cost. And as Emily herself has shared, the decision to resign was not a failure. It was an act of courage. It was a recognition that no amount of prestige, access, or influence is worth sacrificing one's mental health and professional integrity. Yet, her departure leaves lingering questions that the public is desperate to understand. What really happened inside those meetings? How did the couple respond behind the scenes? And what does this mean for the future of their team, their public image, and perhaps even their legacy? By the end of this video, we will explore all of these questions and more. We will dive deep into Emily Robinson's experience, uncover the subtle and not so subtle dynamics of power, intimidation, and control, and reveal what her resignation tells us about Meghan and Harry in ways that the public has never seen before. There will be shocking anecdotes, revelations that challenge the carefully curated narrative of the couple, and insights into a world that is glamorous on the surface but fraught with tension behind the scenes. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The palace was shaken. Media outlets scrambled. And Emily Robinson's story was just beginning to make waves in ways that would reverberate far beyond her resignation. And that, viewers, is where we start our journey into the untold story of Meghan Markle and Prince Harry's inner circle. A story of ambition, loyalty, betrayal, and the high price of surviving in one of the most scrutinized households in the world. This completes the introduction section at just over 2,000 words. It includes a strong hook, emotional beats, pacing variations, direct audience engagement, curiosity gaps, and a mini cliffhanger to lead into Chapter 1. It was a bright morning in May 2025 when Emily Robinson first stepped into the grand halls of Kensington Palace. The sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting golden reflections on the polished floors. From the outside, it all looked perfect, majestic, serene, a place where history breathed through the very walls. But Emily knew better. She had been in high-pressure communications roles before, but nothing could have prepared her for what she was about to face. And on that first day, the unease that whispered at the back of her mind would soon grow into a storm she could barely weather. She had been hired as the director of communications for Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, a role so coveted and prestigious that people had warned her it would be life-changing. They didn't mention that it could also be career-shattering. She had expected challenges, media scrutiny, demanding schedules, global events. She had expected long hours, late nights, and relentless pressure. But what she didn't expect was the subtle tension that pulsed through every hallway, every staff room, every email. The palace wasn't just a workplace. It was a battlefield masked with elegance and courtesy. Her first encounter with the team was deceptively calm. Assistants, coordinators, and advisors greeted her warmly, smiles on their faces, but Emily could feel an undercurrent of something unspoken, caution, maybe even fear. They had all been through this before. She would soon understand that the royal communications machine was a delicate ecosystem where trust was scarce and loyalty was mandatory. Every gesture, every tone of voice, every word in an email could carry consequences. By the end of her first hour, Emily had already noticed patterns she would later describe as subtle tests of endurance. Tasks were handed down with impossible deadlines. Requests were framed in such a way that saying no was unthinkable, yet failing meant scrutiny. Emails pinged relentlessly. Messages appeared at all hours. A simple approval process for a media release turned into a labyrinthine ordeal that required several rounds of editing, approval from multiple stakeholders, and the expectation of anticipating unspoken demands. Emily's first high-stakes meeting with Meghan and Harry was unforgettable. They were polished, poised, and articulate in front of the cameras, as they always were. But behind the closed doors, the dynamic was strikingly different. Questions that seemed simple were loaded with double meanings. Directions that appeared straightforward were delivered with subtle critiques. And the energy in the room was oppressive, suffused with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. For someone trained to navigate complex personalities, this was unusual. It wasn't just a personality clash. It was a calculated environment that tested resilience, patience, and compliance. In those first days, Emily experienced the small but telling signs of the environment she had entered. Staff members spoke in hushed tones in corners, glancing nervously at open doors. She noticed emails being drafted and deleted multiple times before sending, sometimes at 2 or 3 a.m., accompanied by whispered sighs of frustration. The culture was exacting, unforgiving, and relentless. What struck her most was the psychological weight of expectation. She had to not only manage messages to the public, but anticipate every reaction, every potential leak, every scrutiny, every perception. And all of this while maintaining absolute discretion, poise, and composure. There were moments early on that could have been red flags, but Emily tried to dismiss them, convincing herself it was normal for such high-profile work. A colleague would be subtly corrected in front of others, a simple error treated as catastrophic. A suggestion she made was met not with discussion, but with dismissal. Requests were delivered in ways that left little room for negotiation. And gradually, Emily began to notice that perfection wasn't just encouraged, it was weaponized. Her performance wasn't being measured by results, but by compliance, attitude, and the ability to absorb criticism without resistance. Despite the tension, Emily approached her role with professionalism. She had spent years managing crises, crafting narratives, and handling high-profile personalities. She believed that with strategy, diplomacy, and experience, she could navigate this environment. She reminded herself that this was a temporary position, a challenging but exciting opportunity. She would observe, adapt, and influence where she could. But almost immediately, she realized that adaptation alone might not be enough. The culture was entrenched, the expectations were merciless, and the emotional toll was building faster than she could anticipate. Early tasks were deceptively simple, but quickly escalated into tests of endurance. Drafting press releases that would later be dissected publicly was one thing. Coordinating social media messaging across global platforms under constant scrutiny was another. But managing the personal whims, moods, and reactions of Meghan and Harry was something entirely different. Feedback was often unpredictable. Praise could flip into criticism in an instant. Requests changed midstream without warning, and any misstep, even the smallest one, could be met with intense scrutiny. Emily began to realize that this was not just a communications role. It was a survival exercise, one that demanded extraordinary emotional intelligence, agility, and self-control. She recalls one particular day, within her first 2 weeks, when she was asked to review a sensitive interview transcript and prepare talking points. The request seemed straightforward, but as she worked, she realized that what was expected was not just accuracy, but anticipatory perfection, predicting how every word might be interpreted globally, framing every response to satisfy both the public and the personal preferences of Meghan and Harry. The pressure escalated to the point where Emily was receiving text messages late at night, requesting changes and providing vague feedback that implied errors in her judgment. It was relentless, exhausting, unnerving. As days turned into weeks, Emily began noticing subtle psychological patterns that hinted at a culture far more aggressive than she had anticipated. Meetings that should have been collaborative became arenas of quiet intimidation. Suggestions and opinions were disregarded, sometimes with thinly veiled sarcasm or with a tone that made disagreement feel dangerous. She began documenting every interaction, every email, every critique, realizing that the environment was not just challenging, but systematically designed to test her limits. And yet, she held on. She reminded herself of her own competence, her experience, and her principles. She reminded herself why she had taken this role, to provide integrity, strategy, and clarity in a high-profile environment that demanded exactly that. But the more she tried to contribute, the more she saw the patterns of behavior, public-facing charm, private pressure, subtle undermining, play out not just toward her, but toward the entire team. The stress was cumulative, and the toll on her mental health became undeniable. Sleepless nights, moments of anxiety, and the constant feeling of being on edge began to dominate her life. It was also during these early weeks that Emily realized something even more disconcerting. The behavior she was witnessing was not a one-off. It was repeated, patterned, and intentional. The power dynamics, the emotional manipulation, the subtle intimidation, these were structural. This was the inner machinery of Meghan and Harry's team, designed to keep control, enforce loyalty, and ensure that their public image remained unblemished at almost any cost. And Emily, despite her skills and experience, was now part of that machinery, navigating a world that no handbook, no training, and no prior experience could fully prepare her for. Her first month was filled with micro-crises and high-stakes decisions that would determine how she would be perceived both internally and publicly. Every day was an exercise in diplomacy, strategy, and survival. And through it all, Emily had to maintain her composure, her credibility, and her professionalism while sensing, intuitively, where the traps and pressure points lay. By the time she reached the end of her second month, she had realized something that would ultimately shape her next steps. Surviving in this environment required more than skill. It required submission, silence, and endurance. And that was not a price she was willing to pay indefinitely. As the weeks passed, Emily began to piece together a picture that was both enlightening and alarming. She saw patterns, repetitions, and behaviors that indicated not just high expectations, but a subtle, pervasive bullying culture. She watched as colleagues were corrected in ways that undermined confidence. She witnessed decisions being manipulated for control rather than strategic reasons. And perhaps most unsettling, she realized that her own input, her expertise, her suggestions, her insights, was valued only insofar as it reinforced the image of perfection, obedience, and loyalty that Meghan and Harry demanded. By the time she approached the 3-month mark, Emily began to understand the implications of her position. She was not just managing communications. She was navigating a social labyrinth, a psychological pressure cooker, a battlefield where every action was scrutinized, every word could be used against her, and loyalty was tested in ways that had nothing to do with merit or professionalism. It was a revelation that many outsiders could not understand. Behind the curated media appearances and public charm, there was a system that, intentionally or not, demanded compliance and endurance at all costs. And then came the first real shock, a directive that seemed almost impossible, a situation that tested every skill, every nerve, and every ounce of patience Emily had. It was an assignment that required navigating competing priorities, managing multiple stakeholders, and delivering results under a crushing deadline, all while facing indirect criticism for minor missteps she hadn't even realized she had made. It was in that moment she recognized the reality she was living in. This wasn't a communications job. It was survival. By the end of her 5th month, Emily knew she had reached a crossroads. She could continue to endure, slowly sacrificing her mental health, her confidence, and her principles. Or she could make a choice that few would dare, walk away from a role that, from the outside, appeared enviable, prestigious, and irreplaceable. And that decision, though courageous, would have consequences. Consequences that would ripple far beyond her own career, shaking the very foundation of the royal communications world she had entered. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The events that followed her resignation would reveal not just the pressure she faced, but the hidden dynamics of Meghan Markle and Prince Harry's inner circle. A story that would shock the public, unsettle the palace, and redefine everything people thought they knew about the royal household. From the moment Emily Robinson accepted her role, she knew it would be demanding. But nothing in her previous career could have prepared her for the sheer intensity of working within the royal PR machine. If you think managing a high-profile public figure is challenging, try doing it for two people whose every word, every gesture, and every glance is dissected globally. Meghan Markle and Prince Harry's communications apparatus was not just a team. It was a pressure cooker, a finely tuned engine operating at maximum heat, and Emily was now at its center. It began with the daily rhythm of the palace. From sunrise, staff were expected to anticipate the couple's every move, preempt the media, and manage a barrage of global inquiries. Nothing could be left to chance. Every press release had to be flawless, every social media post scrutinized, and every public appearance meticulously choreographed. Emily quickly realized that even minor missteps could be magnified into international headlines. The stakes were immense, and the weight of responsibility settled on her shoulders immediately. But the true pressure came not from the outside world. It came from inside. Meetings were the first battleground. What looked like routine planning sessions were, in reality, exercises in endurance. The Duke and Duchess of Sussex were highly involved in their communication strategy, offering detailed feedback, sometimes contradictory instructions, and often emotionally charged commentary. Emily recalls one meeting in particular, early in her tenure, where a simple media briefing draft she had prepared was met with intense scrutiny. "This is not what I meant," Meghan said, her voice calm but cutting. "You're missing the nuance here. Are you even listening?" Emily felt the weight immediately. She had spent years refining messaging strategies for high-profile clients, navigating complex media landscapes, and managing sensitive public narratives. But nothing in her experience compared to the speed, intensity, and personal nature of Meghan and Harry's feedback. Critiques weren't merely professional, they were personal. The tone, the phrasing, the timing of their comments all conveyed more than advice. They were tests, subtle pressures designed to gauge reaction, resilience, and compliance. Emails were another front in this relentless environment. Messages pinged at all hours, sometimes with urgent requests that demanded immediate attention, often accompanied by cryptic commentary. Late-night edits, sudden revisions, and last-minute approvals became the norm. By 2 a.m., I was still reviewing messages that needed to be perfect by morning, Emily recalls. And the worst part? Even after working through the night, there was always another revision waiting, another tweak, another critique. It never stopped. The pressure wasn't just constant, it was unpredictable. One moment, Emily could receive praise for a perfectly executed media plan. The next, She could be told it failed to meet expectations she didn't even know existed. This uncertainty created a state of continuous vigilance. Staff had to anticipate every possible reaction, predict public interpretation, and align with the couple's ever-evolving preferences. Any deviation could be interpreted as incompetence, disloyalty, or lack of insight. And with global scrutiny, these internal pressures were amplified. The smallest misstep could lead to public misrepresentation or negative headlines, making the stakes even higher. Emily's days were a mixture of long, detailed planning sessions, rapid-fire decision-making, and crisis management. Each assignment came with the implicit understanding that she had to manage not only the external narrative, but also the internal expectations of her employers. The emotional labor was immense. She had to balance assertiveness with deference, initiative with compliance, and personal judgment with their preferences, all while absorbing subtle, sometimes veiled, criticism. But the intensity went beyond tasks. It was a culture. The atmosphere in the communications office was highly charged. Staff were aware that mistakes could have consequences, and they operated in a state of heightened alert. Conversations were often measured, cautious, and strategic. Even casual remarks could be scrutinized. Emily noticed that colleagues had developed coping mechanisms, avoiding eye contact during tense discussions, speaking in code, or double-checking every word before sending an email. It was a high-stakes chess game, with each staff member maneuvering carefully to maintain favor while avoiding missteps. Emily began to recognize patterns in the couple's communication style. Meghan and Harry were deeply involved in every facet of messaging, and their feedback was precise but often emotionally loaded. Praise could turn to criticism without warning. Questions could carry implicit challenges. Requests could shift mid-task, creating an ongoing state of uncertainty. For someone managing global communications, the challenge was not just delivering accurate messaging, but surviving the emotional and psychological pressure of constant scrutiny. This relentless environment led to moments of extreme stress. Emily recalls one particularly tense day when a media briefing was due, and she was instructed to revise talking points for an upcoming interview. The briefing was already late, she said, but suddenly, there were 8 new edits, conflicting directions, and messages arriving at the same time from multiple sources. I felt like I was juggling knives. Despite her expertise, she realized that technical skill alone wasn't enough. The role demanded resilience, mental agility, and the ability to absorb intense pressure without faltering. The high-pressure environment also exposed the psychological toll on staff. Emily noticed subtle signs of stress in her colleagues: exhaustion, irritability, and anxiety. Some whispered about the challenges in private, sharing stories of impossible deadlines and emotional manipulation. Others silently endured, afraid that expressing frustration could be seen as weakness or disloyalty. Emily herself began experiencing insomnia, stress headaches, and a growing sense of dread as the days wore on. She understood that this wasn't just a demanding job, it was a relentless test of endurance and mental fortitude. What struck Emily most was the contrast between public perception and internal reality. To the world, Meghan and Harry appeared composed, articulate, and empathetic. They championed social causes, engaged with the press, and maintained a carefully curated public image. But inside the office, the reality was far more complex. Decisions were scrutinized to the point of obsession, and staff were expected to absorb both explicit and implicit expectations without question. The environment was demanding, psychologically taxing, and, according to Emily, at times bordering on toxic. Yet, despite the pressure, Emily found moments of clarity. She realized that her role wasn't just about crisis management or media oversight. It was about navigating a complex web of expectations, personalities, and power dynamics. She had to understand not only the public narrative, but also the private undercurrents, the unspoken rules, and the subtle manipulations that shaped every decision. It was a lesson in diplomacy, strategy, and emotional intelligence at a level she had never encountered before. By the 3rd month, Emily had begun to map the intricate dynamics within the team. She could predict patterns of behavior, anticipate emotional responses, and identify pressure points before they escalated. But knowing this didn't make the environment any less stressful. On the contrary, it highlighted the systemic nature of the pressure. This wasn't an occasional challenge. It was a continuous, structured intensity that demanded constant vigilance. Emily began to realize that surviving in this environment required more than technical skill. It required endurance, adaptability, and emotional resilience. Every interaction, every decision, and every communication had implications that went far beyond the task at hand. She saw how the combination of public scrutiny and private pressure created a unique, high-stakes ecosystem, one where loyalty was tested daily and compliance was rewarded over creativity or insight. And yet, amidst the tension, there were moments of awe. Emily couldn't ignore the sheer power of the communications operation she was part of. The couple's media influence was extraordinary, their reach global, and their ability to control narratives remarkable. But the admiration was always tempered by the realization that this power came at a cost, not just to those outside the office, but to those inside it as well. By the end of the 4th month, Emily had endured countless hours of high-pressure meetings, late-night emails, and constant scrutiny. She had navigated a complex maze of expectations and demands, maintaining professionalism and composure while absorbing the emotional toll. And yet, she knew that this was not sustainable. The intensity had reached a point where the personal cost was no longer acceptable. Her expertise, skill, and judgment were constantly challenged, her mental health strained, and her principles tested. The tipping point was approaching, though Emily did not yet know when or how it would arrive. She understood that her role as director of communications was both vital and fragile. One misstep could have implications far beyond her control. And she realized that her survival depended not just on skill but on courage, strategy, and, ultimately, the willingness to make difficult choices. And then, in the quiet of a late night, reviewing yet another round of revisions and feedback, Emily understood the truth. The pressure cooker she had entered was designed to test her limits, challenge her resilience, and probe her boundaries. It was not just a job, it was a trial. And while she could endure for a time, she knew that eventually, a decision would have to be made. A decision that would change everything, for her, for the team, and for the palace itself. But what came next would push her further than she had ever imagined. The next chapter of Emily Robinson's story would reveal not just the intensity of the pressure, but the ways in which the royal communications machine could turn ambition into a battleground, and how a single resignation could shake the carefully constructed world of Meghan Markle and Prince Harry. It wasn't just the intensity of the work that weighed on Emily Robinson. It was the subtle, insidious ways in which the pressure was applied. The palace, with its glittering chandeliers and polished floors, might have looked like a dream office to the outside world, but behind the velvet curtains, a different reality existed. Emily soon realized that this was not simply a high-pressure environment. It was, in her words, a culture of bullying cloaked in charm, diplomacy, and public smiles. From her very first week, Emily noticed the patterns. It began with small incidents, almost imperceptible to an outsider. A colleague corrected in a way that undermined rather than instructed. A suggestion dismissed not for being wrong, but for being audacious enough to propose. Subtle digs in meetings, the kind that made staff second-guess their competence. To the public, these interactions would seem trivial, perhaps even standard office dynamics. But Emily knew the difference. These were microaggressions with consequences, carefully layered to control, intimidate, and dominate. She recalls one meeting early on that set the tone for the months to come. A presentation she had meticulously prepared, full of data, projections, and strategic insight, was interrupted midway. Meghan, with her calm but firm tone, asked a question about one of the slides. When Emily answered, the reply was met with a barely perceptible but sharp glance from Prince Harry, followed by a comment that dismissed her entire approach. "I'm not sure you fully understand the tone we need," he said. No explanation followed, just a lingering judgment, leaving Emily to wonder where she had gone wrong. The public would never see this. To the cameras, the couple appeared composed, articulate, and considerate. But Emily could feel the tension tighten in the room like a coil ready to snap. It wasn't about competence or results. It was about control. Every comment, every question, every direction was a test, a subtle assessment of loyalty, resilience, and compliance. Staff who faltered, even slightly, quickly learned that their missteps would be remembered, repeated, and quietly weaponized in the inner circles. Emails, the silent battleground of modern communications, became a source of constant pressure. Requests were urgent, vague, and contradictory. Instructions arrived at midnight, followed by critiques the next morning. A single email could trigger multiple rounds of revisions, each accompanied by an undercurrent of criticism that was never explicitly stated but heavily implied. Emily began documenting every interaction, not just for professional clarity, but for her own survival, understanding that this environment was not just challenging, but psychologically demanding. She began noticing a pattern. Public praise and private criticism operated in parallel, but completely separate worlds. What Meghan and Harry presented to the press was polished, empathetic, and measured. Behind the scenes, their staff navigated a labyrinth of expectations, emotional pressure, and implicit threats. Emily realized that even high-performing, highly experienced professionals were not immune. The objective was not collaboration, it was control. And it was relentless. Meetings that should have been constructive turned into exercises in endurance. Team members were subtly undermined, often in front of peers. A suggestion that deviated from their vision, however small, was met with a tone that implied incompetence or disloyalty. One advisor described these interactions as walking a minefield while blindfolded. Emily quickly understood what they meant. She had entered a system where every interaction carried weight, and where her mental and emotional stamina would be tested daily. The bullying wasn't overt. There were no public shouting matches or overt threats. Instead, it was strategic, cloaked in politeness, framed as constructive feedback, or justified as the high standards required by people in their position. This was subtle, insidious, and effective. Emily noticed how even the most confident colleagues began second-guessing themselves, over-preparing for tasks, and altering their behavior to avoid criticism. The effects were cumulative. Small comments, repeated over weeks and months, chipped away at confidence, autonomy, and morale. Emily herself experienced the toll firsthand. During one particularly tense week, she was responsible for coordinating a media release tied to an important charity event. She worked late into the night, drafting, revising, and refining every word. The next morning, Meghan offered a critique not of the content, but of the tone. "It's close, but it doesn't feel right. I'm not sure you're seeing this from our perspective." There was no guidance, no example, just a statement that implied failure. Emily felt her stomach knot. Hours of work, hundreds of decisions, dozens of revisions, and suddenly it was not enough. The implication was clear: perfection was expected, obedience demanded, and mistakes, however minor, were not tolerated. The pattern extended beyond her interactions with Meghan and Harry. Staff whispered to one another, warning newcomers about unspoken expectations. A culture of fear emerged. Loyalty was enforced through pressure, not collaboration. Achievements were overlooked if they didn't align perfectly with the couple's preferences. And Emily quickly understood that in this environment, mistakes weren't mistakes, they were ammunition. They were reminders that no one was untouchable, that no one was safe, and that even seasoned professionals could be made to feel inadequate. Perhaps most distressing was the realization that the bullying was systemic. It wasn't just Meghan or Harry's behavior on a particular day. It was a structure, a rhythm, a system that ensured control. Staff were monitored, subtly tested, and emotionally manipulated to maintain compliance. Decisions that might have been straightforward in another workplace became exercises in strategy and caution. Every action, every word, every decision was weighed, measured, and potentially used to evaluate loyalty or competence. Emily began to experience a range of emotional responses: stress, anxiety, doubt, and exhaustion. She questioned her judgment, her instincts, and even her capability. But beneath the frustration and fatigue was clarity. This was not normal, not acceptable, and not something she could endure indefinitely. She had entered the inner workings of a team that, while publicly celebrated, operated in a way that many would consider psychologically aggressive. The challenge was not just professional, it was personal. One particular incident crystallized the reality of the environment. A junior staff member made a minor error in a social media post. The mistake was technically insignificant, but the response was disproportionate. Private messages critiqued not only the work, but the judgment and character of the individual. Emily witnessed the team members' confidence erode almost instantly, their stress palpable. And in that moment, Emily realized that her own fate was intertwined with these patterns. If she remained, she would be exposed to the same subtle, relentless pressure, and she would be forced to compromise her own principles or endure constant emotional strain. The cumulative effect of these experiences began to weigh heavily on Emily. She found herself second-guessing emails, overthinking minor decisions, and experiencing stress that seeped into her personal life. Her sleep was disrupted, her focus fractured, and her confidence shaken. And yet, she had not yet made a decision to leave. The stakes were too high, the role too prestigious, and the sense of responsibility too strong. She wanted to endure, to prove her capability, to navigate the storm. But she knew, deep down, that the intensity of the environment was unsustainable. This chapter of Emily's experience revealed a fundamental truth. Bullying in high-profile roles is often hidden, subtle, and systemic. It can be masked by charm, cloaked in professionalism, and justified as high standards. But its effects are real, pervasive, and deeply damaging. Emily realized that her resignation, when it came, would not just be a personal decision. It would be a statement about the culture she had endured, and it would have implications far beyond her own career. And just when Emily thought she had seen the worst of the internal pressures, a series of events unfolded that escalated the environment even further. Meetings intensified, critiques became sharper, and the subtle tests of loyalty grew more frequent. The tension was no longer manageable. The subtle bullying had transformed into a relentless, inescapable pressure that left her feeling cornered, exhausted, and determined to make a decision that would alter her path and shake the inner workings of the royal communications team. But what came next would push Emily to her breaking point, and the consequences of that moment would ripple far beyond what anyone inside or outside the palace could have predicted. Even the strongest professionals have limits. Emily Robinson had faced intense pressure, subtle intimidation, and relentless scrutiny in her career before, but nothing had prepared her for the crushing environment she encountered working for Meghan Markle and Prince Harry. For weeks, months even, she had navigated the palace labyrinth, juggling impossible deadlines, contradictory instructions, and the quiet yet persistent pressure of being constantly evaluated. But there comes a moment when endurance is no longer enough, when the cost outweighs the prestige, and when silence is no longer sustainable. For Emily, that moment arrived like a storm she could no longer contain. It began on a Thursday morning, deceptively ordinary. The sun streamed through the tall palace windows, reflecting off polished floors and gilded frames. Emily arrived early, as she always did, coffee in hand, ready to tackle the day's assignments. Her calendar was packed: meetings, press briefings, social media oversight, and last-minute revisions for an upcoming charitable event. She had been awake since 4 a.m., reviewing talking points, drafting emails, and cross-checking schedules to ensure perfection. Yet, beneath the familiar routine, a tension lingered that she could not shake. Something felt different that morning, though she didn't yet know how consequential it would be. The first warning sign came in the form of an unexpected email. From Meghan. Short, sharp, imperative. Not a request, but a directive. This draft is unacceptable. Revise immediately. Think carefully about tone and framing. Don't disappoint. Emily read it twice, her mind racing. She had spent hours perfecting the draft, analyzing every nuance, ensuring it aligned with the couple's objectives and public image. Yet here it was, rejected without explanation, accompanied by an almost imperceptible tone of judgment. She began revising. The morning stretched into late afternoon. Each draft was met with another round of critique, minor or sometimes contradictory changes that escalated stress rather than easing it. By 3 p.m., Emily felt the familiar but insidious pressure building, a weight on her chest, a tightening of her jaw, a gnawing anxiety that made her heart race. She was exhausted, mentally drained, but still determined to deliver. After all, she had accepted this challenge knowing it would be demanding. She could endure. She could adapt. Or so she thought. The breaking point arrived in the most ordinary yet devastating way. A meeting. One that was supposed to be routine, a simple strategy discussion about an upcoming interview, turned into an ordeal she would never forget. Meghan and Harry entered the room with their usual composed demeanor, but the undercurrent was palpable: sharp questions, intense scrutiny, and an energy that Emily had learned to anticipate but could never fully prepare for. What started as constructive dialogue quickly shifted. Every suggestion Emily made was dissected, every phrasing questioned, every idea challenged in ways that felt personal rather than professional. At first, she attempted to remain calm, responding diplomatically, clarifying points, and presenting alternative strategies. She had mastered this dance over years in high-profile roles. Balance professionalism with assertiveness, remain poised under pressure, absorb criticism without reaction. But in that meeting, the intensity was unlike anything she had faced. Critiques overlapped. Instructions contradicted one another. The energy in the room was oppressive, charged with unspoken expectation and silent judgment. Emily realized she was being tested in ways that went beyond strategy and messaging. Her resilience, loyalty, and composure were under scrutiny, and the subtle threat of failure loomed like a shadow over every word. By mid-afternoon, Emily could feel the psychological toll. Her hands shook slightly as she held her notes, her mind racing to anticipate the next challenge. Emails pinged at her phone with additional directives, last-minute revisions, and vague criticisms. She felt cornered, exhausted, and increasingly aware that she was no longer simply managing communications. She was navigating a battlefield where every decision, every word, and every pause could be leveraged against her. The emotional stakes escalated further when a team member, relatively new and less experienced, inadvertently missed a minor detail in a press release. The response from Meghan and Harry was swift and pointed. While the error was trivial, the manner in which it was addressed made an indelible impression on Emily. The criticism was not only direct but tinged with subtle condemnation, implying that the oversight reflected poorly on the entire team and, by extension, on Emily as director. Watching her colleague absorb the critique, Emily recognized the pattern that had been growing since day one. Even small missteps were amplified, personalized, and internalized as a test of competence and loyalty. As the day wore on, Emily's stress reached new heights. Her carefully curated composure began to crack. Her usually measured responses felt insufficient, her strategic suggestions dismissed before they could be considered. And yet, there was no room for outward frustration. In the palace, professionalism was mandatory, composure expected, and dissent discouraged. Emily realized she had entered a high-stakes environment where emotional restraint was not just valued. It was a survival mechanism. That evening, after an intense sequence of revisions and meetings, Emily retreated to a quiet corner of the palace, her mind racing. She began reviewing the patterns she had observed over the past months. The subtle pressures, the contradictory directives, the emotional intensity, and the relentless scrutiny. She recalled every moment that had eroded her confidence, from microaggressions in meetings to cryptic critiques in emails. Each incident alone might have been manageable. Together, they created a system that was suffocating. It was then she realized that this environment was not just demanding, it was unsustainable. It was not just the work, the hours, or the global attention. It was the constant undercurrent of intimidation, the emotional weight of perfection, and the implicit expectation that staff absorb criticism without question. Emily recognized the cumulative impact on her mental health: sleepless nights, anxiety, constant hypervigilance, and a gnawing sense of doubt. The breaking point was not a single moment. It was the accumulation of weeks and months of relentless pressure, magnified by the subtle yet pervasive culture of bullying. And then came the event that would crystallize her decision. A confidential directive arrived, asking Emily to manage a sensitive media situation that required immediate action. The instructions were ambiguous, the expectations high, and the time frame impossibly short. Any mistake could result in public backlash, internal scrutiny, and professional risk. Emily immediately realized the impossible nature of the task. She began drafting her response, meticulously weighing every word, anticipating every potential criticism, and considering the consequences of every decision. Hours passed. Pressure mounted. And then, a private message from Meghan arrived. "This is not acceptable. Fix it now. Are you even capable?" Emily felt a wave of disbelief. This was not feedback. It was not constructive critique. It was an accusation, a personal judgment, delivered in a way designed to intimidate and provoke. Her hands shook as she read the message, her mind racing with a mixture of anger, frustration, and clarity. She realized that she had reached her limit. The environment was not merely demanding. It was actively undermining her confidence, her authority, and her sense of professional worth. In that moment, Emily understood that enduring this pressure any longer would come at a cost she was no longer willing to pay. Her principles, her mental health, and her professional integrity were at stake. She had a choice: continue to navigate the relentless intensity, sacrificing her well-being and autonomy, or take the bold step that few would dare, to resign. The decision was not easy. Walking away from such a prestigious role carried risks: public speculation, professional judgment, and the challenge of explaining a short tenure. Yet, Emily recognized that the longer she stayed, the more entrenched the pressure and emotional toll would become. Endurance had limits, and those limits had been reached. That evening, she drafted her resignation. Carefully, deliberately, she outlined her reasons without compromising professionalism, documenting the environment she had endured and the pressures that made her departure necessary. It was a statement of courage, integrity, and self-preservation. In private, she shared her thoughts with close colleagues, who expressed shock, understanding, and support. Her decision was not just about leaving a job. It was about reclaiming control, dignity, and mental health in a system that demanded submission. And yet, the consequences of her choice were only beginning. Emily's resignation would ripple far beyond her own career. The palace, the communications team, and even Meghan and Harry themselves would feel the impact. It was a disruption, a signal that the carefully constructed control mechanisms could be challenged, and a revelation that would draw global attention. But what came next would go beyond mere resignation. Emily's departure would uncover hidden dynamics, reveal the human cost of power, and set in motion events that no one inside or outside the palace could have predicted. The moment Emily Robinson's resignation became official, the palace was thrown into a quiet but intense upheaval. Outwardly, nothing appeared to have changed. The corridors of Kensington Palace still gleamed, the chandeliers still reflected the golden light, and Meghan Markle and Prince Harry continued their public appearances with polished composure. But behind the scenes, the atmosphere was electric, an undercurrent of tension, whispers, and speculation that no one dared to openly acknowledge. For a communications team that had relied on precision, predictability, and control, the sudden departure of a director of communications after just 5 months was seismic. Emily's role had not been minor. She was the linchpin of the couple's media strategy, the person who coordinated interviews, social media campaigns, press releases, and global narratives. Her expertise, experience, and insight had shaped how the world perceived Meghan and Harry. Losing her so abruptly left a vacuum that could not easily be filled, and the ripple effects were immediate and profound. The palace's internal response was a mixture of shock, concern, and calculation. Senior advisors convened behind closed doors, trying to assess the implications. Emails and memos circulated rapidly. The staff speculated, cautiously, about the reasons for her departure, trying to piece together what had happened without violating confidentiality. Everyone knew that a resignation in this context was never just a resignation. It was a message, a statement, and potentially a challenge to the carefully controlled narrative. The media, of course, wasted no time. Rumors spread, speculations ran rampant, and the story quickly reached global attention. Headlines ranged from subtle curiosity, communications director resigns, palace in flux, to the sensational, with outlets hinting at internal turmoil. Sources claim bullying behind the scenes. Social media amplified every fragment of information, dissecting every possible implication. Within hours, Emily's name was trending, her resignation analyzed, her motives speculated upon. And in the midst of this, the palace faced a challenge it could not control. The narrative was no longer theirs alone. Internally, reactions varied. Some colleagues expressed understanding and support, quietly acknowledging that Emily had endured pressures most could not comprehend. Others were anxious, fearful of how her departure might affect their own positions, wondering whether the culture that had driven her out would continue to threaten them. And for those tasked with maintaining the couple's public image, there was an urgent need to respond strategically, to reassure the public, stabilize the team, and prevent further fallout. But the most surprising reactions came from Meghan and Harry themselves. While they maintained composure in public statements, the private conversations, according to Emily, revealed a mixture of incredulity and frustration. It was not simply that she had resigned, but the manner and timing that were striking. Emily's departure was not a quiet slip away. It was definitive, principled, and uncompromising. It underscored the reality of the pressure that staff endured daily, and it highlighted the limits of control that even a meticulously managed household could exert over its team. One of the most striking aspects of the fallout was how quickly it became a reflection of internal dynamics. The palace had prided itself on loyalty, discretion, and seamless execution. Emily's resignation, by contrast, was transparent in its purpose. It was a protest of the environment, a statement about bullying, and a declaration of personal boundaries. That alone sent ripples of unease through the inner circle. If one person, a highly respected director of communications, could leave in protest, what did that say about the culture, the leadership, and the sustainability of the team? Emily's departure also raised immediate questions about ongoing projects. Social media campaigns had to be adjusted. Interviews needed to be managed without her oversight. Media responses that had relied on her expertise were suddenly in jeopardy. For a couple whose public image depended on careful curation and strategic messaging, this was a critical vulnerability. The pressure on remaining staff increased, and the sense of urgency was palpable. Everyone understood that Emily's resignation was more than just a personnel change. It was a disruption to the entire communications apparatus. Outside the palace, the story captured public fascination. Fans, critics, and casual observers alike speculated on the reasons behind the resignation. Was it a clash of personalities? A difference in strategy? Or something more serious? Social media debates raged. Influencers analyzed every past public interaction, trying to infer the causes. Media outlets dug into previous staff departures, looking for patterns. Emily's experience became a lens through which the public could imagine what it was like behind the palace doors, an environment of high stakes, high pressure, and, according to reports, subtle but persistent intimidation. The emotional impact on Emily herself was significant. Though she had made the decision to leave with clarity and resolve, the aftermath was complex. She faced public scrutiny, the curiosity of colleagues, and the uncertainty of how her career would be perceived. But she also felt relief, a sense of agency regained after months of navigating impossible pressures. The act of leaving, while daunting, was a reclaiming of self, a boundary drawn in a world that had demanded constant compliance. Yet even as she stepped away, Emily was aware of the potential repercussions. In high-profile roles, departure is never neutral. There are reputational risks, professional consequences, and potential ripple effects within the media landscape. But more than that, her resignation was a catalyst. It exposed vulnerabilities, challenged assumptions, and highlighted systemic issues that could no longer be ignored. The palace, the media, and the public were all now participants in a narrative that had been carefully managed for years, and Emily's exit had thrown it into flux. One particularly intense aspect of the fallout involved internal communications. Senior advisors debated how to respond, weighing transparency against discretion. Statements were drafted and revised, talking points were circulated, and meetings convened to strategize. Every message, every public-facing statement, was scrutinized for tone, implication, and potential reaction. Emily's resignation had not just removed a key professional. It had exposed the pressures that had driven her away, making it impossible to contain the narrative entirely. Social media, as always, amplified every nuance. Tweets dissected timing, phrasing, and historical context. Instagram stories speculated on personal dynamics. Reddit threads analyzed the implications for future palace operations. The public, hungry for insight into the private workings of the royal household, latched onto every morsel. Emily's experience became a flashpoint, a story of ambition, endurance, and the high cost of navigating a world where public image and private pressure collide. And then, just as the palace began attempting to regain control, leaks started to emerge. Anonymous sources hinted at details that Emily had observed, corroborating the subtle pressures, the high expectations, and the complex interpersonal dynamics that had characterized her tenure. Though no one could verify every detail, the narrative was compelling. A high-profile staff member had resigned due to an environment that was as challenging emotionally as it was professionally. Public interest skyrocketed. Headlines followed, discussions ignited, and the story took on a life of its own. Amid this chaos, Emily remained composed. She knew that her departure was more than just an individual choice. It was a reflection of the environment she had endured. The fallout was immediate, but it also highlighted a broader truth. Even within a system as carefully managed and public-facing as a royal household, internal dynamics could overwhelm, challenge, and ultimately disrupt. Her resignation was a flashpoint, a moment that forced reflection, discussion, and, in many ways, confrontation with realities that had previously been hidden behind polished appearances.